All right, guys, I want to just translate for you how raiding works in the four big MMOs in my life right now. I am not currently covering ESO or Destiny, though I have played them. And so if there's like an overwhelming demand for me to add those to these translation guides, I can. But Final Fantasy XIV is my primary MMO. Final Fantasy XIV starts with 8-man content that is called Trials. That progresses to 8-man content that is called Raids. There is content that is larger than that. It really functions totally differently. It's called Alliance Raids, and then raids that are tied to relics, which the other two games would call Legendaries. They work so differently, and their hard modes are just totally different, so just ignore them entirely for this conversation. Trials transition to a hard mode called Extremes, which is the halfway step on your way to Savage, which is the hard mode of Raids. There are two other difficulties called Unreal and Ultimate, but they both work inherently differently. They're not meant to kind of progress your character in the same way. So if you're doing those, you're just looking for in-game content that is just fun for the sake of fun. They are very, very, very optional. What you're mostly going to be looking at is doing Trials, then doing Raids, doing Extremes, then doing Savages. And so that is your traditional method, 8-man content on a weekly lockout in a subscription-based game. Now, you are usually focused on your current Trials and your current Raids. There are 4 bosses in each raid. Trials are individual bosses. There is very little trash in these things to clear. And so when you decide to do old content, you do have the ability to sink down to abilities as they were. Unreal just means removing that concept. And then you have the ability to sink all the way down to minimum item level, which is the hardest way to protect that. Their ultimate content, the hardest content in the game that is cosmetic only, is actually always put in this scaled state. You can't go in there and just beat up on it as it ages the way you can in like old WoW fights, for example. So while talking about WoW here, the number of people that is in a WoW raid has shifted over the years. Now, as I've gone back to WoW in recent expansions, I haven't really gone back to raid because raiding is an enormous commitment in WoW as far as the amount of time and investment that you need to put in if you like to play multiple MMOs. If you only like to play one MMO, it probably is manageable, just depending on how high up the difficulties you plan to progress. The first is going to be the story-based mode. This is called Raid Finder. It's also referred to as LFR, Looking for Raid. Raid Finder is going to scale between 10 and 25 members, I believe is the current count. Their counts have shifted a lot over the years between 10s and 20s, all the way up to 40-man content. So if I get any of these wrong, please correct me down below. Normal content, I believe, is still in the flexible system. So it is 10 to 25 people. It is really just meant to be a step up from story mode and say like, hey, can you respond to a mechanic at all? What you're watching right now behind me is actually a Savage base of the final fight of the last expansion that came out for Final Fantasy XIV, and so that's already asking way more than this would. Heroic is probably maybe comparable to that. It's sometimes compared to Savage. It's hard to compare directly to Heroic, and that is still 10 to 25, so it's still a lot more people than it is in Savage, and it is still on a weekly lockout. And the last and final difficulty is a fixed 20-person. This is Mythic, and this is like meant to just be punishing into the ground. Now, WoW is always focused on its current raid, its most recent raid. That is its plan. And so it is very, like, they have a legacy system, but it doesn't feel as useful as like the roulette system, which makes you engage with old content incredibly regularly in Final Fantasy XIV. It doesn't do anything like that. Their time walking, chromie time syncing systems just feel different. And so I would say you're always focused on the current tier, but the caveat there is that while in Final Fantasy, you're only getting a couple trials at a time and 4 raid bosses every other patch. Every WoW patch, which WoW patches can be a lot further apart than the 3 to 3.5 month, soon to be 4 month that Final Fantasy is, every patch gets a whole new raid, typically. And these raids can have 10 or more bosses. I believe the current 9.2 patch has 11 in it off the top of my head. So they can have a lot of content in there to clear, especially if you're playing at multiple difficulties. It just means that once that content ages out, clearing that content while it's still relevant is called ahead of the curve. Then you're kind of done with it. As we move over to Guild Wars, compared to these two, I would say is the odd one out, but we're going to compare a fourth game just to show why typical MMOs still do have a pattern when you're referring to them from outside the MMO genre. And that is Guild Wars 2, which just released End of Dragons recently, at the beginning of 2022 here. And they have 10-man raids. The easier versions, the kind of halfway steps, are referred to as strikes, and the harder versions are referred to as raids. There have not been that many strikes over the history of the game. They've only got 3 expansions. They are not a subscription-based game like the other 2 are, and so their pacing, their content pacing is substantially less predictable. They've only got like a dozen strikes in the game, and then raid-wise, they've got, I think, like 7 raids, and each raid has 3 to 4 bosses to it. So they really don't have nearly the mountain of content that 14 or WoW does. But WoW doesn't do a horribly good job leveraging its old content, and Final Fantasy does not release as much content that feels relevant at your current level. Whereas in Guild Wars, it kind of spans that gap in a weird way, because once you're level 80, you're always level 80. And so that means that kind of everything they add to the game just kind of adds. With End of Dragons, they were adding 4 more strikes, and that kind of just piles on top of the previous strikes. So it's always kind of additive, and that helps make up a little bit for that content pacing that more consistent patch schedules that have historically been associated with subscription-based games can offer. And so strikes have kind of allowed that to kind of stack up. They're doing something really cool with this expansion where you like fight somebody in the solo campaign, and then that comes back as a 10-man strike, and then that comes back in their hard mode, which is referred to as challenge mode. So very, very cool. There's lots of reasons to run them. They also have all sorts of open world content, and Guild Wars is just a totally different content offering than these other games. And then there's Lost Ark. Right now, the big MMO on the horizon is Lost Ark. That's what everybody's talking about. A Korean-based MMO that just came over thanks to Amazon, to all of us here in NA and EU, so it's much easier to get started. It is free to play, like Guild Wars, except that Guild Wars does still ask you to, it's still more buy to play. This is truly a free-to-play game where there is a little bit, in my opinion, some pay-to-win mechanics, and their raid, just to kind of offer a point of comparison, is much more Diablo-esque, and really shows the difference in what a traditional MMORPG is and what an ARPG is. It's 4-player, and you can do it daily, as opposed to these kind of weekly lockouts we're associated with. You can do 2 Guardians each day. When you first hit level cap, at least when I first hit level cap, I was around item level 210, and then you have to build up. The first Guardian becomes available at 302, and then they're about every 40 item levels for raid tier 1. Raid tier 2 starts at 460, raid tier 3 starts at 802, 960, and the final raid tier is from 1302 to 1385, so it's much tighter, but that's a very, very high item level to get to. They don't have like health bars. You're in there, you have a flat enrage at 20 minutes. Like, you have to get there. There's limited number of respawns, so like there's not a trinity at all. Guild Wars kind of messes with the trinity, and because their content is forever, their legendaries take a long time to grind and all that, so it's always working a little bit differently, but ultimately it is at least a shadow of what Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft, the more typical MMORPG experience is. Lost Ark works totally differently, and I just wanted to offer it as a point of comparison for anybody getting in there. I have played ESO in the past, I've played Destiny in the past, I played like EVE Online and like some other ones that are just very different. I did play Guild Wars 1 and Destiny 1. And so if you guys want me to compare those, I would just need to get back to kind of playing those a little more and kind of knock the dust off, but I'd be happy to do so. This should just give you enough information that if you played one or more of these games, or you're currently playing one or more of these games and want to try one of the other ones, you at least know what all of the terminology that people are referring to is, because sometimes it can feel very overwhelming when you go into a game and you're like, hey, I was this expert, this incredibly talented player, or I was working through becoming an incredibly talented player, I was making progress, I was I was approaching these harder difficulties, or I was at least clearing all of the normal content, and then you go to pick up this other game because that's where your friends go, or that's what's new, or you just want to try something different or whatever, and then you feel like you start all the way back down at the ground floor just because people aren't using the same words. And that's really not fair. And so I just wanted to kind of share that experience and kind of share what I've learned along the way as I talk about kind of how raiding works in an MMORPG and what the different terms within raiding mean as you go out there and try to make your characters more powerful, or as you try to go out there and just be able to communicate. Maybe you just want to sit in a Twitch stream with people who are playing a different game than you, and you just want to be able to speak the same language. Kinda.